Let me introduce you to my next friend and guest for this evening, someone who practices real democracy around the world. He is the former finance minister of Greece. He's an economist and an author. It is a pleasure to introduce you to Янис Варуфакис.
I'm Янис Βαρουφάκης with a quick message to friends, comrades, colleagues to the United States and beyond regarding, what else? The general election, the presidential election in America. How do I see the prospect of a very thin, marginal victory by Joe Biden as the worst possible outcome? And let me explain that. I'm deeply happy that Trump is not going to be in the White House. But on the one hand, we have a resurgence, not a diminution, of Trumpism and of the alt-right and of the neo-proto-fascist, racist, Republican right-wing. They feel strengthened by the outcome. They got millions more votes. And also this sense that they have, which is of course completely false, but nevertheless it is shared amongst them, of having been robbed of the White House by the liberal establishment. This augurs ill for all of us because of the radicalization of this movement that combines racism and a complete embracing of everything which is misanthropic, xenophobic, and particularly regressive. Now let's look at our side of politics, progressive politics. The one good thing, the silver lining for us supporters of Bernie Sanders, after Sanders was yet again impeded by the establishment within the Democratic Party from becoming a genuine opposition to Donald Trump, from winning the nomination of the Democratic Party. The silver lining was that at least there was some collaboration between the Sanders team and the Biden team that produced a Green New Deal of sorts. Not what I would have liked, but an interesting, nevertheless, economic policy to be implemented if Biden and Harris won the presidency and also the Senate. The fact that Biden is not going to control the Senate, and the fact that he has not had this landslide that he was banking on, means that now a president that was originally unwilling to implement a genuinely progressive Green New Deal now has been liberated from the obligation to do so as a result of not controlling the Senate. So, in contrast to the Trumpist right, which is going to be united, radicalized, and also strengthened and reinforced by the fact that they are going to be in opposition, not to mention the fact that the next 2 years are going to see a Great Depression descending upon the United States, which is going to energize their opposition. In contrast to that, think of our side. We will have spent the last few months arguing amongst our own progressives that always saw Biden, quite correctly, as the representative of big business, that nevertheless they should hold their nose and vote for Biden because of the Green New Deal. Now there will be no Green New Deal. We will have, in other words, have helped put in the White House a president who is acting simply on behalf of big business, if he's acting at all, given the paralysis of the administration in view of the fact that it's not controlling the Senate. Had Trump won the White House, I would have been mourning, of course, but at least Democrats would be facing 2 or 4 years of radicalization, of rethinking and reorganizing. But now, the next 2 years will be a period during which only the Trumpists are going to be organizing, while we, progressives, are going to have to be defending a president who does not want to be in the same camp as us against big business. As for the rest of the world, I very much fear the neocons that sided with Biden and who will be returning to the Pentagon and the State Department. I hope those fears are proven false. I'm pleased that the Bolsonaros, Modis, Le Pen, Salvinis and the rest of the nationalist, xenophobic Internationale are going to lose their great supporter in the White House. But at the same time, we have, let us not forget, the radical center back in control of the White House and the Pentagon, and they have a very sorry record of interventions, of military adventures. I hope that they do not jeopardize the only good thing that Trump did on the international stage, which is effectively not to start a new war. With greetings from Greece and the sincere hope that Joe Biden is going to prove me wrong, this is Янис Βαρουφάκης on behalf of DN25. Carpe diem. Let's continue the struggle. We have a lot to do.
Thank you, Янис. I would like to turn now to say something else that is too often unsaid, for which the words are thought to be too daring, too premature, not yet ready, and so on. But I would like to move the conversation forward, so I'm going to talk about it. What the United States lacks and needs is a new political party. It needs to break the stultifying dilemma of two monopolistic parties, to stop this process in which the allowable discourse in the society is limited to what the right will tolerate and what the left will tolerate, when right and left are limited by the Republican and Democratic parties. Let's take a look at what some of the costs of not challenging their monopoly mean for us right here, right now. The United States is a disaster when it comes to the COVID-19 crisis. Before COVID came, we knew as a society that there are dangerous viruses. In 1918, the United States suffered a devastating virus, one that started in a military base in Kansas, right in the middle of the United States. It killed nearly 700,000 people, 3 times what we have already suffered now with COVID-19. We know what viruses can do. We learned again with SARS, with Ebola, with MERS. We know. History has taught us, and recent past history has taught us again. We knew it would be possible. Likewise, we know that capitalism as an economic system is stunningly unstable. Wherever capitalism has settled over the 300 to 400 years it has been the emerging and then dominant economic system in the world, every 4 to 7 years on average, it has an economic downturn. You know, a crash, a recession, a depression, a bust, a crisis. We have many words for something that is so prevalent in our environment. So we know what the story is. And we have no reason not to be ready for, aware of, the crises that capitalism imposes on us every 4 to 7 years on average. Millions lose their jobs. Businesses go bankrupt. Cities, towns, whole countries have their budgets disappear because unemployed people can't pay taxes. And so the revenues needed to provide public services dry up. And in this capitalist system, just as the private sector goes into a crisis, by dragging down the revenues of the public sector, you have fewer public services exactly when you need more to compensate for the failure of the private sector. If that isn't a dysfunctional system, what is? We've had 3 crashes of capitalism in the United States in this new century. We had the dot-com crisis in 2000, the subprime mortgage crisis in 2008, and now the COVID-19 crisis in 2020. 20 years of a new century, 3 crises, works out to a little less than every 7 years, just in time, just on schedule. We knew we faced a crisis. And since the last one was in 2008, we knew by 2019, by 2018, and by 2017, we were due for the next one. We knew, like we knew the virus could always come. But we weren't prepared. We weren't prepared. And what do I mean by not prepared? I mean the Republicans didn't have us prepared, and the Democrats didn't either. Hospitals have been closing in the United States in recent decades. Closing. Why? Because it wasn't profitable to keep them open. Oh goodness, you're allowing the capitalist notion of profit to be so understood by the monopolizing 2 parties that we closed the institution that might have enabled us to be prepared for a virus. We know you need tests. They should be produced, accumulated, stockpiled in warehouses around the country. You know, like masks and ventilators and everything else. But we didn't, did we? The companies didn't do it because it isn't profitable. You know, to make masks and store them in warehouses where you have to watch them and clean them and repair them and replace them for who knows how long before the next virus hits. Too risky, not profitable. We won't do it. Of course, the government could come in and buy all that and store it and preserve it and maintain it. Could do that. That's, after all, what the government does with military equipment. Same issue. But they didn't do it with the medical. They didn't, because the private medical producers didn't want the government in there. That's for them socialist medicine, and they won't have that because they're terribly afraid that the public will, sooner or later, realize what a rip-off, profit-driven business medicine is. So we weren't prepared. The private sector didn't find it profitable, and the control they have over the 2 monopolizing parties was more than enough. That's why we don't have a national health system. That's why we don't have Medicare for all. That's why we don't have single-payer medicine. And that's why we weren't ready for the virus, and why it is hurting us and killing us on a scale virtually no other country has allowed. Wow. The failure is literally cataclysmic. And the dealing with the economic crisis, if anything, it's even worse, other than not being so deadly in the life and death sense. So, of course, what do you need to do today when there are, by rough estimate, 20 to 40 million Americans unemployed? Wow. What are you doing? Answer: nothing. Neither of the 2 monopolizing parties has been able to think for 1 sustained hour, let alone for a year, that the way to handle the unemployment in the private sector is to employ people in the public sector. What are we doing giving millions of people money and not asking them to give something back to society? Sure, with social distancing and masks and all the ways of keeping people healthy that we can learn from all the other countries who've done exactly that and who don't have tens of millions of unemployed. And what would our unemployed do? Oh, goodness, we haven't tested most Americans yet. Unemployed people could become an army of testers. We have 1 million fewer people working in the public service in this country than we did a year ago. As I just explained, we need more public services now because of the broken economy, because of COVID-19. But we don't have more public services because we have fired 1 million of our public employees. Take the unemployed and put them to work for the cities and towns, providing the public services we need now more than ever. There is no problem. This country did that in the 1930s when the government hired roughly 15 million unemployed Americans. And let me explain what the democratic system we have, in quotations, failed to do. Did we have a vote in this country whether we would like to see these people employed by the government or unemployed? That was not put up for vote because the two parties know that what they support would lose. So it isn't put up to democratic vote. The mass of people who are unemployed want a job. The mass of us who are not getting the product of what those unemployed people could do, we would like them to be paid properly for work that we can all enjoy with them. That's a logical, democratic response. But we don't have that. We are denied that. Even though it's part of our history, neither party at this point found it useful, helpful for them to even debate the subject. Wow. Wow. So what do I conclude? We need to break up the monopoly. We need to do what we have done in the economic sphere at least sometimes. We need trust busters. Only the trust that has to be busted is the political trust, the political monopoly. And one of the easiest, best ways to do it is to begin to build a party that we already know has mass support in the United States, so it can be an effective challenger of the political monopoly. And what do I mean? Here comes the thing not dared yet to be spoken. We need a socialist party. We probably need several, because socialists disagree among themselves, as they always have, and as indeed they should. We should have a range of socialist parties presenting their critiques of capitalism, their alternatives to capitalism. And why am I confident that this is the way to go? Because we've already had the evidence that there's a basis for it. That's what 2 races by Bernie Sanders showed us. That's what the Occupy Wall Street movement, by spreading to 350 cities in a matter of weeks, showed us. That's what the successful races of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and the other members of the squad, now doubled in size, that's what they're telling us. Socialists in Missouri, in New York, in California, in Minnesota, yeah, the basis for a socialist elected official, obviously there. Millions of people, obviously there. Millions not only willing to vote, but willing to contribute, as the Bernie Sanders campaign so dramatically showed. The money is there, the people are there, and Lord knows the demand in our monopolized politics is there. For a long time, General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler kept everybody else out of the automobile market in the United States. And they made fun of the Tesla. Well, they're not making fun anymore. Turns out, if you open it up, if you allow a different perspective, on the very idea of what an automobile is and what makes it run and how you power it. Yeah, turns out you can do things. And you know, socialism is like that. There are socialist parties, important ones, in virtually every European country. There are, in fact, multiple socialist parties, some with the name, some with other names, across Europe. Civilization hasn't crumbled there. The economic and political systems are in as many ways better than ours as we are better than them. They show us it's feasible, it's manageable, and it can generate very good outcomes. Let me give you an example. One of the countries most successful in emerging out of the crisis of 2008 in Europe was a country that chose not to go the route of austerity, as was done so devastatingly in Greece, in Italy, in Britain, and so on. The country I'm talking about is Portugal, an old, well-established country in Europe. Portugal, for the last 5 or 6 years, has been governed by a coalition. They, and unlike the United States, have multiple parties, not just two. They don't seem to want a monopoly of two. They seem to want real freedom of political choice. Governments there tend to be coalitions because no one party runs the society. You know, the way it works here. No. Multiple parties have to get together. So they've been governed by a coalition these last years, a coalition that refused to impose an austerity, that instead spent money. The Portuguese are famous. Even before these crises hit, they handled their drug problem in a completely different way from that in the United States. Much more successful. Anyway, the coalition is a coalition of three parties. The Portuguese Socialist Party, plus the Portuguese Communist Party, plus the Portuguese Green Party. That's right. A coalition of various kinds of socialists. And they're doing fine. And they are a model for others. There's no reason we don't have that here. And I want to close my list of guests to present to you by offering two people who in different ways are moving in the direction I'm talking about, wanting to see change, activating it, educating it, mobilizing it. The failures we are living through in our public health, in our economics, are more than enough, but it's not a complete list, to justify change. So let me introduce a colleague of mine, an economist, a young woman who has been spearheading the intersection of economic change, racial change, and the centrality of cooperative enterprises, dealing with those problems that are so deep in the United States. So I would like to introduce you, if you do not already know her work, Jessica Gordon Nembhard.
My name is Jessica Gordon Nembhard. I'm a Black political economist and specialist in community economic development and cooperative and solidarity economics. I actually have very mixed feelings about this election. I'm heartened that so many people voted, especially in the middle of a COVID pandemic. I'm disgusted by the long lines they had to wait in and the continued suppression and intimidation of Black and brown and incarcerated voters. I'm surprised and frustrated that so many people voted to keep the current administration, which I thought had proven itself to be dysfunctional, tyrannical, racist, and misogynistic. I continue to be against private financing of political campaigns. I'm horrified at the billions of private dollars that were spent on the campaigns. I believe more than ever that we need all political campaigns to be only and equally publicly financed. And I think we have to eliminate the Electoral College. No way around that. We, the people, are not really in control of our elections. I'm also disheartened that the Democratic Party bargained that it had to stay centrist in order to win, but of course I'm excited that we have the first Black woman vice president. Given all that, I'm hopeful that these next few years will be ones where we can truly and honestly discuss the need for genuine economic transformation and move toward the solidarity, economic, cooperative commonwealth that I have written and talked about for over 10 years. If nothing else, this past year has clearly pointed out that our current economic and political systems are not working. We need universal health insurance and health care. We need a real public health system. We need transparency and accurate information from our government. We need true democratic practices. We need community and cooperative ownership and to democratize capital. We can't achieve racial justice or racial and gender equity without economic democracy and economic justice, but we also can't achieve economic democracy without racial and gender equity. So we have to work intersectionally and on multiple fronts. I'm convinced that we can achieve this in part by starting to or continuing to practice economic democracy in our everyday lives and demand it throughout our society. We should commit to an extensive nationwide campaign for cooperative and solidarity economics education. We should demand that public money be dedicated to support cooperative business development, especially worker cooperatives. Co-ops, especially worker cooperatives, address community needs. They generate income, they create wealth, they redistribute capital through democratic participation in production and distribution. In addition, there are spillover effects from economic cooperation, such as leadership development, collective decision-making, conflict resolution and transformation, profit sharing. And so we need to think about how co-ops, how we can make this a reality for more of us. So I just want to make my plug. Co-ops provide access to quality goods and services. They save costs, they increase income, they fairly distribute wealth. They anchor resources, recirculate them in a community. They save or create decent jobs. They develop economic agency and collective action. They develop leadership, as I said. And they develop economic democracy. What do I mean by that? Economic decisions and activities that are people-centered, not centered on profit maximization. Create grassroots economic frameworks based on solidarity, cooperation, and human dignity. We reduce hierarchy and dominance in economic relations and decision-making. Economic democracy also allows multiple voices and multiple stakeholders to participate together. Workers and invisible laborers have the largest voice in what they make, what it costs, how they work together, what they get paid, what happens to the surplus. In worker cooperatives, workers have the voice in decision-making. And finally, I want to add that the research I've done on Black co-ops finds that co-ops help to combat racial discrimination, to enable Black community ownership and decision-making, leading to Black self-determination. Co-ops, mutual aid, economic solidarity enable access to and control over culturally and geographically sensitive and appropriate goods and services. Co-ops and collective ownership increase Black economic stability, self-sufficiency, and group independence, and increase community wealth and prosperity for Blacks. These benefits are similar across all groups and for all humanity. As usual, none of this will happen or be achieved if we are not vocal and active with our demands, both starting to practice and design the world we want to live in, while demanding that our government enact policies and allocate money to support this vision. Now's the time.
Thank you, Jessica. For my last guest commentator, I want to introduce you to Lee Carter. He is an elected member of the Virginia House of Delegates, the legislature in the state of Virginia. He is an ex-Marine, And he is a socialist. He knows what he speaks about. He's a critic of capitalism. He ran some years ago and he was recently reelected. That's right. He embodies what is possible already now under all of the adverse conditions of a monopolized political system. He is the exception. He is breaking the mold. He is emerging like others. He shows that it's possible. He shows what is possible. And his voice, therefore, is particularly important in reacting to the election process of which he is now an integral part. People like him, inside the Democratic Party, where some are, outside, where more are, those two parts of an emerging socialist movement and of an eventual socialist party or parties are very important voices to listen to. So with pleasure, I introduce you to Lee Carter.
Hi, I'm Lee Carter. I'm a member of the Virginia House of Delegates and the only elected socialist in any Southern legislature. I'm here today to talk about the consequences of the 2020 election. Now, this election is one unlike any other that we've lived through. It's the first time, to my knowledge, the United States has had a presidential election during a global pandemic. We've had pandemics before, and we've had consequential elections before, but never at once. Now, those consequences of the election are a bit more subtle than you might be actually hearing about. A lot of people are talking about how this election is the most important election of all time, how this election has saved democracy. But the differences between the outgoing president, President Trump, and the incoming president, President-elect Biden, are really a lot more subtle than most people make them out to be. Now, Donald Trump certainly was a president unlike previous presidents in that he displayed the cruelty that he was exhibiting with the powers of his office really at the forefront of what he did. He bragged about the cruelty behind his policies. But those policies truly were a difference in degree, more so than a difference in kind, over his predecessors. When you look at policies like family separation at the border, yes, Donald Trump had a much more cruel policy of family separation at the border, but it was a difference of how people were separated rather than whether or not people were separated. His predecessor, President Obama, and his predecessor, President Bush, both had exceedingly cruel policies of deportation for people at the border. His policies on the economy were a difference in degree, not a difference in kind from his predecessors. President Trump used his powers as president to more directly intervene on behalf of big business giants, but that's something that we've seen before. President Obama directed tens, hundreds of billions of dollars in bailouts to the large corporate giants, and President Bush did before him. The policies that actually impact people on the day-to-day were differences in degree rather than differences in kind with President Trump versus his predecessors. Healthcare policy, people still have to pay exorbitant premiums that rise every year, exorbitant deductibles that rise every year, and still receive the lowest quality of care of any country in the industrialized world. Because again, these policies towards healthcare, towards the economy, towards immigration, towards foreign policy, these were all differences in degree rather than differences in kind. So this election has really been one of the system putting the mask back on. The president that's leaving office is one who displayed his cruelty. He bragged about it. He was proud of it. But the president that's coming in will have policies that will still have victims. And we still have to organize to end those policies. We still have to organize to create the kind of world where people have the freedom of motion, to create a better life for themselves. If they're escaping a war-torn country or a poor economy where they're coming from, they have to be able to come here and actually create a better life for themselves and their families. We have to create the kind of world where people don't have to choose between bankruptcy and going to a doctor. We have to we have to build the kind of world where people are actually in control of the economy rather than being controlled by it. And that's something that's not going to be done in a single election. That's something that needs to be done through constant effort, through struggle, through organization, through people taking the initiative and building a cooperative economy, one where working people own and operate the enterprise where they work on a democratic basis, a one-person, one-vote basis, because that is the base of power in our society. When we have actually built an economy that works for us because it's being worked by us, that is when we will be able to actually change these policies in kind rather than in degree. That is when we will be able to choose between a president that really serves us and one that serves the corporate interest rather than just two different versions of corporate presidencies. That is the consequence of the 2020 election.
Thank you, Lee. I would like to conclude by asking all of you not only to thank our guests, as I do, for adding their commentaries to this important chapter in American history, and indeed in the history of the world, because the United States remains an important player in this world, even though that importance is declining. And indeed, the notion of American decline and the decline of the United States is perhaps another theme that underlay this election, and that, like the need for a socialist party, can't quite be spoken yet. But the decline is there if you're willing to see it. And the starkest example is the People's Republic of China. I'm not here to analyze to what degree their self-naming as socialist is or isn't reasonable. Socialism, as I keep telling everyone, has always been debated as to what exactly it means, what its boundaries separating it from capitalism actually are. And that's a good debate to keep going. I'm in favor of that debate. I have a position on that debate, but that's not what we're here to talk about. Chinese technology now rivals that of the United States. Chinese production now rivals that of the United States. In the last few days, China was one of 15 countries that created the largest free trade zone in the world. 30% of the world's product is now going to be traded over the next few years without tariffs, or at least with sharply reduced tariffs, in a movement towards multilateral, open-ended trade, the exact opposite direction that Mr. Trump was taking this country, and which the Democratic Party and its establishment allowed him to do. The Chinese are everywhere in the ascendant. They're a rising power. 2 weeks ago, they sent up rockets with new 6G technology, where the United States is still trying to catch up to China on 5G. And there are many, many more examples. It is dangerous and difficult for countries to go through their decline. One of the major ways of dealing with it is denial. And that is extremely popular in the United States. So we have competitive bashing of China, denouncing that for issues real and imagined, instead of trying to figure out a way not to have economic rivalry, become military engagement between two nuclear powers. The two-party monopoly hasn't figured out how to deal with this society, how to deal with its own decline, let alone with the ascendancy of the People's Republic of China. It's another in the long list of things this political monopoly could not and is not handling effectively, let alone democratically. So yes, we need fundamental change. And a message of all my guests is the one I want to close with. More than anything else, we don't need now to tell ourselves there isn't a basis for a socialist change. We know there is. We've gone out collectively and done the work to find them, to name them, to mobilize them, and to get elected by them. And we know people around the world are struggling in the same direction. That's why it was important for Янис Варуфакис, a leader of that effort in Europe, to join with us as a representative of all the others. We are not small and we are not alone. And what we're doing has a better claim for saving democracy and installing it in our world than the loudmouth champions who refer to a system that never was democratic and to themselves as the saviors of the system that never was. We can do better than that politics, and the reason is that we can do better than capitalism. January 13th, 7:30 p.m. in the year 2021. This is Richard Wolf for Democracy at Work. Good night.